Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving deep into the sociology of education, and we're going to be looking at Pierre Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Passeron's Reproduction in Education, Society, and Culture. Some of you have sent in some really intriguing excerpts, and this book, it really doesn't shy away from challenging conventional wisdom, does it?
It definitely does it. It's a groundbreaking work. It really shook up the field when it came out. Bourdieu and Passeron argue that education, rather than being this great equalizer that we often think it is, often actually reinforces existing social hierarchies.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty bold statement. So instead of promoting social mobility, education actually contributes to what they call social reproduction.
Exactly. They see education in a system that, while appearing neutral on the surface, subtly transmits the dominant culture and values of society to students. It's not just about learning facts and skills. It's about shaping individuals in a way that makes them fit into the existing social order.
So it's almost like education is this giant sorting machine, placing people into these slots based on their background rather than their actual potential.
I think that's a great way to put it. Bourdieu and Passeron actually use the term classificatory machine to describe this process. And here's where it gets really interesting. They point out that while we claim to value things like technical competence in modern society, educational titles, like university degrees, actually function a lot of the same ways as nobility titles of the past.
Whoa, okay, hold on, nobility titles. Now that's a comparison I wouldn't have expected.
It's more apt than you might think. In feudal societies, your birth determined your social status. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. Bourdieu argues that, in a way, educational titles do the same thing in our society. They serve to concentrate social status, even though we say we live in a meritocracy.
So even though we say we value individual achievement, our social origins still have this massive influence in determining our educational success and ultimately our place in society.
Precisely. And this is where the concept of symbolic violence comes in.
Okay, now there's a term that needs some unpacking. What exactly is symbolic violence?
Symbolic violence is this subtle form of power, often unseen and unquestioned, where the values and beliefs of the dominant culture are imposed upon other groups. And education, according to Bourdieu, is a prime example of this.
So it's not about physical force, but rather the power of language, expectations, and these unspoken rules that shape our behavior.
Exactly. And what's even more, the authors argue that because these forms of social control are so subtle, we often don't even question them, which makes this era particularly ripe for us to understand how power really operates.
This makes me think about those subtle, unspoken expectations we encounter in classrooms. Were there ever times when you felt like you had to conform to certain ways of speaking, thinking, or even behaving in order to succeed?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely something we should all reflect on. Now, to really grasp this concept of symbolic violence, we need to dive into two other key terms, habitus and cultural capital.
Okay, great. I'm ready. What are habitus and cultural capital, and how do they fit into this whole picture?
All right, so habitus is basically the set of ingrained habits, skills, and dispositions that we acquire through our upbringing. It's like a set of lenses that shapes how we see and interact with the world around us, including our educational experiences.
So it's like a set of unconscious rules for navigating the world based on the social environment we grew up in.
Exactly. And then there's cultural capital. This refers to the knowledge, tastes, and cultural competencies that individuals possess. Think of it as a currency that can be exchanged for advantages in the education system and beyond.
So someone who grew up surrounded by books, went to museums, and had parents who emphasized academic achievement would have more cultural capital than someone who didn't have those experiences.
Precisely. And Bourdieu and Passeron emphasize that education, particularly early childhood experiences, really shapes both our habitus and our cultural capital.
That makes a lot of sense. You know, if you grew up in a family that really values education and has the resources to help you cultivate that cultural capital, you're obviously going to be more likely to succeed in a system that rewards those things. It's almost like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly. And this brings us to the crucial role of language in social reproduction.
Language, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, Bourdieu argues that the language we use, our fluency, and our comfort with academic discourse are heavily influenced by our social class. It's not just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about the way we structure our thoughts, the types of arguments we make, even our tone of voice.
So a student who grew up hearing complex vocabulary and sophisticated sentences at home is going to be more comfortable in an academic setting than a student who didn't have that exposure.
Absolutely. Bourdieu even cites this fascinating study where students were asked to define a word that didn't even exist. Students from more privileged backgrounds were more likely to confidently offer really elaborate, though totally incorrect, definitions, showing a certain ease with language that stemmed from their upbringing.
Wow, that's a powerful example. It really highlights how these subtle differences in language can give some students real advantages in the classroom. I wonder if any of our listeners have ever felt like an outsider in educational settings because of the way they spoke or wrote. It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. Now let's turn our attention to another key aspect of Bourdieu's analysis: examinations. He sees them as a key mechanism of social reproduction.
Ah, yes, exams, the source of so much stress and anxiety for students. But how do they contribute to social reproduction? I mean, are they supposed to be objective measures of knowledge?
Well, that's the illusion, or as Bourdieu might say, a form of symbolic violence. While they appear to be neutral, exams actually reward those who already possess the cultural capital favored by the dominant class.
So it's not just about what you know, but also how you know it, how you express that knowledge, and how you conform to the expectations of the people grading the exams.
Precisely. Think about the types of questions that are typically asked on exams. They often require a certain type of thinking, a familiarity with academic discourse, a certain way structuring arguments, all things that are more likely to be developed in upper-class households.
It's almost like they're designed to tend on not just your knowledge, but also your class background.
In a sense, yes, and this is how examinations contribute to social reproduction. They give this illusion of meritocracy, suggesting that everyone has an equal chance based on ability, when in reality, the odds are stacked against those who haven't been given the tools to play the game.
It makes you think about all the debates we have about standardized testing. Are these tests really measuring what they claim to measure, or are they simply reflecting existing inequalities in our society?
It's a question worth pondering for sure. Bourdieu would argue that we need to be very critical of these types of assessments and recognize the hidden biases they often contain.
And speaking of hidden biases, Bourdieu also challenges the concept of educational wastage. He argues that we need to understand dropout rates and academic failures not as individual shortcomings, but in the context of these social and technical selection processes.
Yes, he's very critical of this notion of wastage. He argues that it blames individual students, right, rather than looking at the systemic factors that contribute to these outcomes. In fact, he suggests that even those who are deemed failures in this system can acquire a certain social status and even profit from the experience.
That's a really interesting perspective. It encourages us to think critically about how we define educational success and failure, and to consider the broader societal forces at play.
It certainly does. It challenges the traditional narrative that sees education solely as a path to individual achievement and highlights its role in perpetuating existing social structures.
So if education can be a tool of social reproduction, can it also be a tool for social transformation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Bourdieu doesn't really offer easy answers. He recognizes how deeply ingrained these systems of inequality are, but he does suggest that education can, under certain conditions, challenge the status quo.
What kind of conditions are we talking about? Give us some hope here.
It would require a fundamental shift in the way we think about education. It would mean moving away from this narrow focus on individual achievement and recognizing the broader societal forces that shape educational outcomes.
So instead of just trying to help a few individuals climb the ladder, we need to focus on changing the structure of the ladder itself.
Precisely. It would require addressing the inequalities in resources and opportunities that exist outside the classroom. It would mean questioning the values and assumptions that underpin the curriculum and the way it's taught.
That's quite a challenge, but it's certainly one worth exploring further. So for our listener, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into Bourdieu and Passeron's critique of education and explore some potential paths toward a more just and equitable system. Welcome back to our deep dive into Bourdieu and Passeron's reproduction in education, society, and culture. In part 1, we explored how education, rather than promoting social mobility, can actually reinforce existing social hierarchies through things like symbolic violence, habitus, and cultural capital.
Right, and we talked about how language and exams can be used to subtly advantage those from more privileged backgrounds, perpetuating inequalities under this guise of meritocracy.
Right, and we left off with that question, can education also be a tool for social transformation? So let's pick up that thread. You mentioned that Bourdieu believes it's possible for education to challenge the status quo, but only under certain conditions. So what are those conditions?
It's not about these simple fixes, but rather a fundamental shift in our thinking. It means moving away from this narrow focus on individual achievement and recognizing the broader societal forces at play that shape educational outcomes.
So it's not enough to just help a few individuals climb the ladder. We need to change the structure of the ladder itself.
Exactly. We need to address the inequalities in resources and opportunities that exist outside the classroom. We need to question the values and assumptions that underpin the curriculum and how it's taught.
That sounds like a pretty monumental task.
It is. But Bourdieu believed it's a necessary task if we want to create a more just and equitable society. It starts with awareness, recognizing how power operates in seemingly neutral systems like education. It requires us to be critical of our own assumptions and biases, and be willing to challenge the status quo.
Okay, so let's zoom in on one specific aspect of this. Bourdieu's analysis of the literate tradition and its role in social conservation. He argues that certain educational systems, like the French system with its emphasis on humanistic studies, have historically played a key role in preserving the cultural capital of the dominant classes.
Absolutely. Think about the traditional curriculum, often heavily weighted towards literature, philosophy, history, subjects that require a certain familiarity with the dominant culture's values and forms of expression.
So it's not just about the content of what's being taught, but also the way it's taught. The emphasis on things like abstract thinking, critical analysis, the ability to express yourself eloquently. These are all skills that are more likely to be developed in upper-class households.
Precisely. Bourdieu argues that this emphasis on the literate tradition creates a system where students from privileged backgrounds are more likely to excel, not because they're inherently more intelligent, but because they've been immersed in this type of thinking from a young age.
It's like they've been given the secret code to unlock the system.
Exactly. And this code is often invisible to those who haven't been initiated into the literate tradition. They might struggle to understand the expectations, the nuances of language, the unspoken rules of the game.
It's like trying to play a game without knowing the rules. You might be able to figure some things out, but you're never going to be on an equal footing with those who already know how to play.
Exactly. And this, Bourdieu argues, is precisely how the system perpetuates itself. It creates this self-fulfilling prophecy where those who already have cultural capital are more likely to succeed, and those who don't are more likely to fall behind.
So how do we break this cycle?
Well, it's not about abandoning these subjects or these skills. It's about making them accessible to everyone. It's about recognizing that different forms of knowledge and expression are valuable, and providing all students with the tools they need to succeed.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and dive deeper into Bourdieu's analysis of examinations. He's pretty critical of exams, seeing them as a mechanism that masks social selection while appearing to be objective and fair.
Yes, examinations are a prime example of what Bourdieu calls symbolic violence. They appear to be neutral and objective, but in reality, they favor those who already possess the cultural capital that's valued by the system.
So it's not just about what you know, but how you know it, how you express that knowledge, and how you conform to the expectations of the examiners.
Precisely. Think about the types of questions that are typically asked on exams. They often require a certain type of thinking, a certain familiarity with academic discourse, a certain way of structuring arguments, all things that are more likely to be developed in, say, upper-class households.
It's almost like they're designing to test not just your knowledge, but also your class background.
In a sense, they are. And this is how examinations contribute to social reproduction. They perpetuate this illusion of meritocracy, suggesting that everyone has an equal chance based on ability, when in reality the odds are stacked against those who haven't been given the tools to play the game.
This makes me think about all the debates we have about standardized testing. Are these tests really measuring what they claim to measure, or are they simply reflecting existing inequalities in our society?
That's a great question. Bourdieu would argue that we need to be very critical of these types of assessments and recognize the hidden biases they often contain.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another interesting concept Bourdieu raises, the idea of educational wastage.
This is a concept that Bourdieu was very critical of. He argues that dropout rates and academic failures need to be understood not as these individual shortcomings, but in the context of social and technical selection processes that serve to maintain social hierarchies.
So instead of blaming students for failing to measure up, we should be looking at the systemic factors that contribute to these outcomes.
Precisely. Bourdieu argues that this very notion of wastage is based on a flawed understanding of the role of education in society. In fact, he suggests that even those who are deemed failures in the system can acquire a certain social status and profit from the experience.
That's a really thought-provoking perspective. It encourages us to think critically about how we define educational success and failure, and to consider the broader societal forces at play.
Absolutely. It's about challenging that dominant narrative that sees education solely as a means of individual advancement, and recognizing its role in reproducing existing petrostructures.
So if education can be a tool of social reproduction, can it also be a tool for social transformation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Bourdieu doesn't offer easy answers. He recognizes the deeply ingrained nature of these systems of inequality, but he also suggests that education can, under certain conditions, challenge the status quo.
What kind of conditions are we talking about? Give us some hope here.
It would require a fundamental shift in the way we think about education. It would mean moving away from this narrow focus on individual achievement and recognizing the broader societal forces that shape educational outcomes.
So instead of just trying to help a few individuals climb the ladder, we need to focus on changing the structure of the ladder itself.
Precisely. It would require addressing the inequalities in resources and opportunities that exist outside the classroom. It would mean questioning the values and assumptions that underpin the curriculum and the way it's taught.
It sounds like a monumental task.
It is, but Bourdieu believes it's a necessary task if we want to create a more just and equitable society.
All right, so let's turn our attention to another key aspect of Bourdieu's analysis: examinations and the illusion of meritocracy. He's pretty critical of exams, seeing them as a mechanism that masks social selection while appearing to be objective and fair.
Yes, examinations are a prime example of what Bourdieu calls symbolic violence. They appear to be neutral and objective, but in reality, they favor those who already possess the cultural capital valued by the system.
So it's not just about what you know, but also about how you know it, how you express that knowledge, and how you conform to the expectations of the examiners.
Precisely. Think about the types of questions that are typically asked on exams. They often require a certain type of thinking, a certain familiarity with academic discourse, a certain way of structuring arguments, all things that are more likely to be developed in upper-class households.
It's like they're designed to test not just your knowledge, but also your class background.
In a sense, they are. And this is how examinations contribute to social reproduction. They give the illusion of meritocracy, suggesting that everyone has an equal chance to succeed based on their abilities, when in reality, the odds are stacked against those who haven't been given the tools to play the game.
This makes me think about all the debates we have about standardized testing. Are these tests really measuring what they claim to measure, or are they simply reflecting existing inequalities in our society?
It's a question worth pondering. Bourdieu would argue that we need to be very critical of these types of assessments and recognize the hidden biases they often contain.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about another interesting concept that Bourdieu raises: the idea of educational wastage.
This is a concept that Bourdieu is very critical of. He argues that dropout rates and academic failures need to be understood not simply as individual shortcomings, but in the context of social and technical selection processes that serve to maintain social hierarchies.
So instead of blaming students for failing to measure up, we should look at the systemic factors that contribute to these outcomes.
Precisely. He argues that even those who are deemed failures in the system can acquire a certain social status and profit from the experience.
That's a thought-provoking perspective. It encourages us to think critically about how we define educational success and failure, and to consider the broader societal forces at play. Welcome back to our deep dive into Bourdieu and Passeron's Reproduction in Education, Society, and Culture. You know, we've covered so much ground, really digging deep into how education can often reinforce existing social hierarchies, and we've explored some potential strategies for creating a more equitable system. But I have to admit, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it can feel pretty overwhelming when you start to see the depth and complexity of these issues.
Exactly. We've talked about challenging the status quo, rethinking our assumptions, and addressing those subtle biases that can disadvantage students from less privileged backgrounds. But where do we even begin? How do we translate these ideas into meaningful change?
It's a great question, and it's one that a lot of educators, policymakers, and researchers are grappling with right now. I think the first step is acknowledging the problem. Recognizing that our education systems, as well-intentioned as they may be, aren't neutral entities. They're shaped by our history and our social structures, and as a result, they can perpetuate those inequalities we see in the wider society.
So awareness is key, right? Recognizing those subtle forms of bias and privilege that are operating even in the most well-meaning schools and classrooms.
Absolutely. We need to develop that critical lens, that ability to question our assumptions about merit, achievement, and even the fundamental purpose of education. What are we really trying to achieve with our education systems? What values are we promoting?
Those are some big questions, and once we start asking them, I think it naturally leads to the next step, which is moving from awareness to action. So what are some concrete things we can do, both as individuals and as a society, to create a more just and equitable system?
There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but I think focusing on a few key areas can make a real difference. First, we need to address the glaring resource disparities between schools in different communities.
Right. It's hard to talk about equal opportunity when some schools have state-of-the-art facilities, well-paid teachers, and abundant resources, while others are struggling just to keep the lights on.
Exactly, and that's where challenging funding formulas that perpetuate these inequalities comes in. All students, no matter where they live, deserve access to quality education, period.
Absolutely. Providing equal resources is fundamental, but it's only part of the equation, right?
Right? We also need to take a long, hard look at the curriculum. Whose knowledge and experiences are being valued and prioritized? Whose stories are being told? Whose perspectives are being centered? A truly equitable curriculum is one that reflects the rich diversity of our society and challenges those traditional hierarchies of knowledge that we've been talking about.
It sounds like you're talking about more than just adding a few diverse books to the reading list or celebrating a multicultural holiday. It's about a more fundamental rethinking of what counts as valuable knowledge.
Precisely. It's about decolonizing the curriculum, challenging Eurocentric perspectives, and creating space for multiple narratives and ways of knowing. It's about recognizing that intelligence and ability take many forms, and that our education systems should reflect that.
And this ties into what we were discussing earlier about the literate tradition and how it can advantage certain groups while disadvantaging others.
Exactly. We need to broaden our understanding of what constitutes valuable knowledge and recognize that there are many pathways to success.
That's a really important point. We've also talked about the role of language in social reproduction and how students who are already comfortable with academic discourse have a leg up in the classroom.
Yeah, it's something we need to be really mindful of. And this isn't to say that we should abandon the teaching of academic language. It's an important tool for critical thinking and communication. But we do need to make sure that all students have the opportunity to develop those skills and feel comfortable using language in different contexts without feeling like they have to erase who they are to succeed.
Right. It's not about forcing everyone to conform to a single way of speaking and thinking, but rather about creating a more inclusive environment where different forms of communication are valued.
That's a great way to put it. We want students to feel confident expressing themselves authentically without feeling like they have to code switch or suppress their own linguistic identities.
Now, we've spent a lot of time discussing the role of exams in perpetuating inequalities, and I know Bourdieu was pretty skeptical of them. He saw them as a mechanism that can often reinforce existing power dynamics. So what do? Are exams inherently problematic, or can we make them more equitable?
Honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer. Exams are deeply embedded in most education systems. They do serve a purpose, helping us assess student learning and understanding, but we can certainly make them more equitable.
And some of the ways we can do that are by moving away from that over-reliance on multiple choice tests, right? Those often reward rote memorization and test-taking strategies over genuine understanding.
Right, exactly. We can incorporate more open-ended questions that allow students to demonstrate critical thinking, analysis, problem-solving skills. Those are the skills that are really valuable in the long run.
I completely agree. And we can also explore alternative forms of assessment. Things like portfolios, presentations, projects, where students can showcase their learning in a more holistic and multifaceted way.
Absolutely. And of course, as we've touched on before, we need to ensure that the language used in exams is clear and accessible to all students. No unnecessary jargon or overly complicated wording that might disadvantage those who haven't had the same opportunities to develop their academic language skills.
It's about leveling the playing field, isn't it? Making sure that all students have a fair chance to demonstrate what they know and what they can do.
That's the goal, isn't it? To create a system that recognizes and nurtures the potential of all students.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. Bourdieu and Passeron's work has really challenged us to think critically about how education operates in society. It can be a bit disheartening to see how these systems can perpetuate inequalities, but I also think their analysis gives us some tools to work towards a more just and equitable future.
I agree. Their work is dense, I'm not going to lie. But it's so valuable because it pushes us to question our assumptions and really confront those uncomfortable truths about our education systems. But I think it also offers a glimmer of hope, By understanding how those mechanisms of social reproduction work, we can start to dismantle them. We can create systems that truly empower all students, regardless of their background.
It's a challenging task, but it's one that is absolutely crucial to creating a more just and equitable society. So to all our listeners out there, we want to leave you with this. What role can you play in building that better future for education? Whether you're a student, a teacher, a parent, a policymaker, or simply a concerned citizen, your voice and your actions matter, so keep asking those tough questions. Keep pushing for change. Keep believing that a better world is possible.
Because it is. The future of education, and really the future of our world, depends on our collective commitment to creating that more just and equitable society.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, challenging, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better future.